The estate. A burden I must bear.
It says, "Look for the oak by the old well."
The will clearly designates Rosewood Manor to Character 2, citing these documents as evidence.
This is a forgery. You have no right to this estate.
I don't believe...
Why is she even here? She does not belong in this courtroom. The words echoed across the chamber just loudly enough for everyone to hear. A few people laughed. Others exchanged amused glances. At the center of the room, 10-year-old Maya Brooks lowered her eyes and tightened her grip on the small notebook resting in her lap. The courtroom itself was magnificent, with polished oak walls, tall windows overlooking downtown Atlanta, and rows of spectators gathered to witness one of the most talked-about inheritance hearings in the city. Yet despite the elegance surrounding her, Maya felt smaller than ever. She sat alone at the far end of the front row while members of the powerful Harrington family occupied nearly every other seat. Expensive suits, designer handbags, and expressions of confidence filled the room. They looked like people who already knew how the day would end. Maya looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. At least that was what everyone seemed to believe. Across the aisle, Victoria Harrington adjusted her pearl necklace and leaned toward one of her cousins. Neither bothered lowering their voices. "The judge should have dismissed this nonsense weeks ago," Victoria said. "A child cannot simply appear and claim a connection to Edward Harrington." Her cousin smiled. "Especially not this child." More laughter followed. Maya heard every word. She had become used to whispers over the years, used to people speaking about her rather than to her. But somehow this felt different. Perhaps because there were so many of them. Or perhaps because this was not just another family gathering where she could quietly leave the room. Today, everyone was watching. Reporters occupied several rows near the back. Legal assistants carried stacks of documents. Even strangers seemed interested in the outcome. Yet no one appeared interested in Maya herself. At the front of the courtroom stood a large framed photograph of Edward Harrington, the billionaire real estate developer whose passing had triggered the dispute. His silver hair, calm smile, and steady eyes seemed to watch the proceedings from across the room. Maya had never met him, at least not that she remembered. Yet somehow his name had changed her life. 2 months earlier, a routine review of estate records had unexpectedly uncovered a reference connected to her. Since then, attorneys, investigators, and family members had been arguing over questions nobody seemed able to answer. Why was Maya's name attached to certain files? Why had Edward's personal attorney requested her presence? And why had confidential documents remained sealed for so many years? Nobody knew. Or if someone did know, they were not talking. Maya glanced toward the defense table where Daniel Foster quietly organized a leather briefcase. Unlike everyone else in the room, he had never treated her like an inconvenience. He had never promised answers either. Whenever she asked questions, he simply smiled and said, "The truth has a way of arriving exactly when it should." Those words frustrated her more than once. Today they offered little comfort. The courtroom doors opened again. Additional members of the Harrington family entered, filling the remaining seats. Several noticed Maya immediately. Their expressions ranged from irritation to amusement. One elderly relative shook his head. Another smirked openly. Maya looked down at her notebook and pretended not to notice. Outside the tall windows, dark clouds gathered above the city skyline. Inside, tension continued building. Then Daniel Foster closed his briefcase, stood slowly from his chair, and looked toward the judge's bench. For the first time all morning, his expression carried something unexpected. Confidence. The courtroom slowly settled into silence as the judge entered and took his seat behind the bench. Everyone rose. The scrape of chairs against polished floors echoed through the chamber before the room became still once again. Maya remained seated between Daniel Foster and a legal assistant after the proceedings officially began. She tried to focus on the judge's opening remarks, but her attention kept drifting toward the enormous framed photograph of Edward Harrington standing near the front of the room. The billionaire's image seemed strangely out of place among the stacks of legal documents and inheritance reports. It felt less like a photograph and more like a silent witness. The case began with routine arguments. Attorneys representing various branches of the Harrington family presented claims regarding ownership of assets, investment holdings, and real estate properties scattered across Georgia and several neighboring states. Names, numbers, and legal terms filled the air. Most of it meant very little to Maya. What she did understand was one simple fact. Everyone in the room wanted a piece of Edward Harrington's fortune. Several hours passed before her name was finally mentioned. The moment it happened, the atmosphere changed. Victoria Harrington stood and adjusted her jacket before addressing the court. "Your Honor, my family has cooperated fully throughout this process. However, we continue to object to the inclusion of Maya Brooks in these proceedings." Maya felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. Victoria continued, "There is no evidence connecting this child to our family, our estate, or our legal interests." A few relatives nodded in agreement. Her presence serves only to delay resolution. More whispers followed. Maya stared down at her notebook. The familiar feeling of being unwanted settled over her once again. Daniel Foster remained perfectly calm. He made no objection. He simply listened. Victoria noticed and smiled slightly. "In fact," she continued, "the property at the center of this dispute has belonged to the Harrington family for generations. There is no legal basis whatsoever for an outsider to claim any interest in it." The judge glanced toward Daniel. "Mr. Foster?" Daniel slowly rose from his chair. "I respectfully disagree." The confidence in his voice immediately drew attention. Victoria folded her arms. "Then perhaps you would like to explain why." Daniel paused for a moment. "Not yet." Confusion spread across several faces. Even the judge appeared surprised. "Not yet," Victoria repeated. "No," Daniel replied, "because the court has not yet seen all relevant documents." The room grew quiet again. Maya looked up. This was the first time she had heard him speak with such certainty. Victoria laughed softly. "More mystery documents." Several relatives chuckled. "Mr. Foster has been promising dramatic revelations for weeks." Daniel did not react. Instead, he opened his briefcase and carefully removed a sealed envelope. The thick, cream-colored paper appeared old. Very old. Several spectators immediately leaned forward. Even the court reporter glanced up. Daniel placed the envelope on the table, but did not open it. "What is that?" Victoria asked. Daniel looked directly at her. "A document requested by Edward Harrington himself." The smile vanished from her face. For the first time all day, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Maya noticed it immediately, and as dark clouds continued gathering beyond the courthouse windows, she began to suspect that whatever rested inside that envelope might be the reason Daniel Foster had remained so calm from the very beginning. The sealed envelope seemed to draw every eye in the courtroom. Even the soft hum of air conditioning felt louder in the silence that followed. Daniel Foster rested one hand lightly on the aged paper while the judge studied it from the bench. Victoria Harrington stared at the envelope as though it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Moments earlier she had appeared completely confident. Now that confidence was beginning to crack. "Your Honor," Daniel said calmly, "this document was placed under legal protection by Edward Harrington nearly 12 years ago. Its contents were not to be revealed until specific conditions were met." Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. "And those conditions have now been met?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Maya sat perfectly still. She did not fully understand why everyone seemed so focused on one envelope, but she could feel the tension building around her. Across the aisle, Victoria rose from her seat. "I object to introducing any document that has not been previously disclosed to all parties." Her voice remained steady, but there was something different underneath it now. "Concern." Daniel nodded politely. "The document has already been authenticated by the estate's independent legal review team." That answer immediately weakened her objection. The judge adjusted his glasses and reviewed several pages in front of him. "The court will allow preliminary discussion of the document." A low murmur swept through the spectators. Maya glanced toward the large photograph of Edward Harrington again. For reasons she could not explain, she felt as though the billionaire had somehow anticipated this moment years before it happened. Daniel slowly lifted the envelope. The paper showed signs of age. The seal itself carried the embossed Harrington crest. "Before I open this," he said, "the court should understand why Mr. Harrington created it." Victoria folded her arms tightly. Daniel continued, 12 years ago, Mr. Harrington became concerned that certain family records had been misplaced, overlooked, or intentionally ignored. Several people shifted uncomfortably. As a result, he ordered a private investigation into portions of his personal history. The room grew even quieter. Maya noticed that some members of the Harrington family suddenly avoided eye contact with one another. Daniel removed a folded document from the envelope. It was not a property deed. Not yet. Instead, it appeared to be a handwritten letter. He unfolded it carefully. This letter was written by Edward Harrington himself. The judge nodded for him to proceed. Daniel began reading. The billionaire's words filled the courtroom. They spoke of responsibility, legacy, family. But one passage immediately captured everyone's attention. If these instructions are ever read publicly, it means the questions I feared have finally returned. When that day comes, the truth must be placed above convenience, reputation, and inheritance. Several spectators leaned forward. Reporters scribbled notes. Victoria's expression hardened. Daniel continued reading until he reached another section. This time his voice slowed slightly. There exists evidence connected to a property known as Rosewood Manor. That evidence must be examined before any final determination regarding ownership or succession is made. The name seemed to change everything. Even people unfamiliar with the case recognized it. Rosewood Manor was not merely a mansion. It was the crown jewel of the Harrington estate, a historic property worth millions of dollars. For decades, everyone assumed ownership would remain within the family. Yet as Daniel carefully lowered the letter, Maya noticed something that made her heart race. Attached to the final page was an old photograph. And the moment Daniel saw it, his expression changed completely. For several seconds, Daniel Foster simply stared at the photograph attached to the letter. The courtroom waited. Reporters stopped writing. Even Victoria Harrington seemed unsure whether to speak. Slowly, Daniel removed the photograph and held it beneath the overhead lights. The image was old, its colors faded by time. It showed a younger Edward Harrington standing in front of Rosewood Manor on a bright summer afternoon. Beside him stood a woman no one in the courtroom immediately recognized, and standing between them was a small child. Maya could not see the photograph clearly from where she sat, but she noticed the reaction it produced. Daniel's normally calm expression had shifted into something closer to surprise. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Foster?" Daniel looked up. "Your Honor, this photograph was included with Mr. Harrington's private instructions." Victoria rose immediately. "A photograph proves nothing." Several relatives nodded. "People take photographs every day." Daniel did not argue. Instead, he carefully approached the clerk and provided a copy for the court display system. Moments later, the image appeared on a large monitor visible throughout the courtroom. Gasps spread through the room. Maya finally understood why. The child in the photograph looked remarkably familiar. Not identical, not enough for certainty, but enough to make people stare. Victoria's face tightened. "That is ridiculous," she said. "Thousands of children could resemble that picture." Yet her confidence sounded weaker than before. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps." Then he pointed toward the woman standing beside Edward Harrington. "Does anyone recognize her?" Silence answered. Several family members exchanged puzzled looks. The woman was clearly important to Edward. They stood close together, comfortable together, yet no one seemed willing to identify her. Daniel reached into his briefcase again and removed another document. During Mr. Harrington's private investigation, this photograph was reviewed by independent researchers. He paused. The woman was identified. Victoria folded her arms. And who was she? Daniel glanced down at the report. Her name was Angela Brooks. Maya felt a strange sensation in her chest. Brooks, her own surname. Around the courtroom, whispers immediately erupted. Victoria's eyes widened slightly before she regained control of her expression. "Coincidence," she said quickly. "Brooks is a common name." Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the photograph over. "There is something else." The room became silent once more. Written across the back of the photograph was a short handwritten message. Time had faded portions of the ink, but most remained visible. Daniel carefully read the words aloud. "For the future of our family. For the child who must one day know the truth." Maya felt her pulse quicken. The message sounded less like a note and more like a promise. Across the room, several members of the Harrington family appeared visibly uncomfortable. The photograph no longer looked like a meaningless keepsake. It looked like a clue Edward Harrington had intentionally preserved. Daniel returned the photograph to the evidence table and looked toward the sealed documents still waiting inside his briefcase. "This image is only the beginning," he said calmly. Because once investigators identified Angela Brooks, they discovered something hidden inside estate records that had gone unnoticed for years. Victoria stared at him. "What records?" Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward Maya before returning to the judge. "Records containing a signature that nobody thought mattered." The courtroom remained unusually quiet after Daniel Foster mentioned the signature. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the courthouse windows, turning the afternoon sky a muted gray. Inside, every person seemed focused on the documents resting on the evidence table. Maya sat perfectly still. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she sensed that the conversation was no longer about whether she belonged there. It was becoming about why she belonged there. Daniel opened a thin file folder and removed several photocopies of estate records. Unlike the dramatic photograph that had captured everyone's attention moments earlier, these pages appeared ordinary. Rows of dates, property references, legal approvals, nothing that seemed remarkable at first glance. Victoria Harrington noticed the same thing. "Surely we are not delaying the court for paperwork that has existed for years," she said. A few relatives nodded. Daniel remained calm. "That is precisely the point." He placed one page beneath the courtroom display camera. The enlarged image appeared on monitors throughout the room. "These records have existed for years." He pointed toward a signature line near the bottom. Yet almost no one noticed this entry. The judge leaned forward. Several attorneys did the same. Maya could not understand the legal language, but she could see a handwritten signature near the corner of the page. Daniel turned to another document. Then another. The same signature appeared repeatedly. Identical. Consistent. Carefully written. "Who signed these?" the judge asked. Daniel looked down at the file. Angela Brooks. A wave of whispers immediately spread through the courtroom. Victoria's expression darkened. "That proves nothing," she said quickly. "Employees, consultants, contractors. Hundreds of people sign estate documents." Daniel nodded. "Normally, I would agree." He selected another page from the folder. Except Angela Brooks did not sign these documents as an employee. The room became still again. Daniel displayed the final page. This document carried additional notations beside the signature. Several family attorneys immediately leaned closer. The significance was obvious to them long before it became obvious to everyone else. Angela Brooks signed as a designated beneficiary representative connected to Rosewood Manor. Even the spectators reacted. Maya looked around the room in confusion. She did not understand why the statement mattered so much, but she could see its effect. Victoria no longer looked amused. Several Harrington relatives exchanged nervous glances. One attorney quietly whispered to another. Daniel continued. "For years, this designation was overlooked because investigators focused on ownership records rather than supporting documents." He paused. But Edward Harrington specifically instructed his legal team to preserve every file connected to this signature. Maya looked toward the large photograph of Edward Harrington again. The billionaire seemed to be leaving clues across time, one piece at a time. Daniel carefully closed the folder and opened another. This one appeared older, much older. The pages inside showed signs of age and wear. "During the review process, we discovered something else." His voice remained steady. "A secondary record connected to the same property." Victoria immediately stood. "Your Honor, I object to this endless sequence of surprises." The judge looked toward Daniel. "Do these records directly relate to the matter before the court?" "They do." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Daniel reached into the folder and slowly removed a single document protected inside a transparent sleeve. The paper appeared older than anything shown so far. Across the top was the name Rosewood Manor. Across the bottom was a signature nobody in the courtroom expected to see. And beside that signature was a name that had been hidden from public view for more than a decade. The document seemed to hold the entire courtroom hostage. Nobody spoke as Daniel Foster carefully placed the protected page beneath the display camera. The enlarged image appeared across every monitor in the room. Maya leaned forward in her seat. The paper was old, older than any document presented so far. Its edges had yellowed with time, and several official seals were visible near the bottom. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then one of the attorneys representing the Harrington family suddenly sat upright. Another removed his glasses and looked again. The significance was beginning to spread across the room. Daniel allowed the silence to linger before speaking. This record was filed 13 years ago and sealed under Mr. Harrington's direct instruction. Victoria Harrington stared at the screen. "What exactly are we looking at?" she demanded. Daniel glanced toward the judge. A supplemental property designation connected to Rosewood Manor. The words immediately triggered another wave of whispers. Rosewood Manor had been discussed throughout the hearing, but always as an asset. Always as property. Never as a clue. Daniel pointed toward the lower section of the document. Most people focused on the ownership records. His finger moved slowly across the page. Very few people examined the attached beneficiary provisions. The judge leaned closer. "And what do those provisions show?" Daniel took a breath. "They show that Edward Harrington created a protected succession clause connected to an individual whose identity was intentionally withheld from public filings." Victoria rose from her chair. "That is impossible." Her voice echoed through the chamber. "Every beneficiary associated with the estate was disclosed years ago." Daniel calmly shook his head. "Not this one." Maya could feel her heart pounding. She still did not understand how any of this connected to her, yet every new document seemed to pull the mystery closer. Daniel turned another page. Attached behind the designation was a notarized statement bearing Edward Harrington's signature. The courtroom became silent once more. "This statement explains why the name was withheld," Daniel said. Mr. Harrington believed public disclosure could place unnecessary pressure on the beneficiary before certain facts were verified. Several reporters immediately began writing. Victoria looked increasingly unsettled. "Who was the beneficiary?" she asked. Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward Maya. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Dozens of heads turned in her direction. Maya froze. Daniel returned his attention to the document. "Before I answer that question, the court should understand one more fact." He lifted a second page from the file. The protected beneficiary was connected through Angela Brooks. The surname immediately reignited discussion throughout the room. Angela Brooks, the woman in the photograph. The same woman whose signature had appeared throughout the estate records. Daniel waited until the noise faded. Then he pointed toward a line near the bottom of the page. For more than a decade, this name remained hidden beneath sealed legal protections. Even the judge appeared intrigued now. "Can the court see the name?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." He carefully removed one final sheet from the sleeve. The paper had remained concealed behind the others until that moment. Maya watched as he unfolded it. The room seemed to stop breathing. Then Daniel looked directly toward the bench and spoke words that instantly changed the direction of the entire case. "The hidden name is not Angela Brooks," he said. "It is the name of the child designated to succeed her." The words settled over the courtroom like a sudden change in weather. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the reporters seemed to forget their notebooks for a moment. Daniel Foster carefully unfolded the final page and placed it beneath the display camera. Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Across the aisle, Victoria Harrington stared at the document with growing disbelief. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Daniel looked toward the judge. "The court has already received authentication reports from independent examiners." The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed." Daniel adjusted the page so everyone could see it clearly. At the top appeared Edward Harrington's signature. Beneath it was a statement explaining the protected succession clause. Several legal terms filled the page, but one section had been highlighted years earlier by Edward himself. Daniel began reading aloud. "In the event that Angela Brooks is unable to exercise beneficiary rights connected to Rosewood Manor, those rights shall transfer directly to her designated successor." The room remained silent. Daniel continued. "The identity of that successor shall remain sealed until verification is completed according to the instructions attached herein." Victoria suddenly stood. "And was it ever verified?" Her voice sounded sharp now, stripped of the confidence she carried at the beginning of the hearing. Daniel slowly turned another page. "Yes." A murmur swept through the spectators. Maya felt her hands trembling slightly. She clasped them together beneath the table. Everything seemed to be moving toward a destination she could not yet see. Daniel lifted a small photograph attached to the verification file. Unlike the older image presented earlier, This one showed a much younger child wrapped in a blanket. Attached beside it was a hospital registration record, then a guardianship record, then a chain of legal documents connecting one file to the next across more than a decade. Each document pointed to the same conclusion: the same child, the same protected identity, the same succession clause. Victoria stared at the evidence. "Who is it?" she demanded. "Who is this successor?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and removed a final envelope. This one appeared newer than the others. Written across the front were 4 words in Edward Harrington's handwriting: "Open only upon verification." The entire courtroom watched as Daniel carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single letter. He unfolded it and began reading. If this letter is being read, then the investigation has reached its conclusion. The child identified within these records deserves the truth, regardless of whether that truth is convenient for anyone involved. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. "For years, I feared that greed and assumption might overshadow fairness. That is why I required independent verification before her name could be revealed." Maya felt dozens of eyes shifting toward her. Daniel lowered the letter and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the verification process is complete." The judge leaned forward. "Then the court will hear the name." Daniel took a slow breath. Victoria stood frozen. The spectators sat motionless. Rain continued falling against the courthouse windows. Then Daniel turned toward Maya for the first time since the hearing began and said softly, "The protected successor identified by Edward Harrington is Maya Brooks." The moment Daniel Foster spoke Maya's name, the courtroom erupted into stunned whispers. Reporters looked up from their notes. Attorneys exchanged astonished glances. Several members of the Harrington family appeared, completely frozen. For a few seconds, nobody seemed capable of processing what they had just heard. Maya herself sat motionless. Her name echoed through her mind again and again. She had entered the courthouse believing she was little more than an unwanted observer. Now she was suddenly standing at the center of a mystery that stretched back more than a decade. Victoria Harrington was the first to recover. "That is impossible," she said sharply. "A protected successor does not automatically inherit ownership." Daniel nodded calmly. "You are correct." Victoria looked relieved for a brief moment. Then Daniel continued, "Which is why we have not yet discussed the final document." The relief immediately vanished. A hush settled over the room. Maya looked toward the briefcase resting beside Daniel's chair. Until now, every revelation had come from letters, photographs, and supporting records. Yet he was speaking as though something even more important remained hidden. Daniel slowly opened the briefcase and removed a large legal folder. Unlike the previous documents, this folder was protected inside a secure archival sleeve. Several official seals were visible through the transparent covering. The judge immediately took notice. "What document is that?" Daniel carefully placed it on the evidence table. "The document Edward Harrington instructed me to reveal only after the successor's identity was legally verified." Nobody spoke. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Victoria stared at the folder. What could possibly be left? Daniel looked directly at her. The answer to the question this entire hearing was supposed to resolve. He opened the sleeve. Inside rested a thick collection of papers. At the top sat a notarized declaration signed by Edward Harrington. Beneath it was another document bearing county registration marks and official property seals. Daniel lifted the first page. For years, everyone assumed Rosewood Manor would remain within the Harrington family through traditional succession. Several relatives nodded instinctively. That assumption had guided every argument presented during the hearing. Daniel turned another page. However, Mr. Harrington's final estate instructions created an exception. The room became still once more. Maya felt her pulse racing. Victoria gripped the edge of her table. Daniel carefully separated the upper pages and revealed the document underneath. The moment the official title became visible, several attorneys gasped. One reporter nearly dropped her pen. The judge leaned forward. "Is that what I think it is?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Maya could not see the page clearly, but she recognized the reaction immediately. This was the document everyone had been waiting for. Daniel lifted it slightly so the courtroom display cameras could capture every detail. Official seals, registration numbers, property descriptions, signatures. The image appeared across every monitor in the room. For the first time all day, absolute silence filled the courthouse. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief. Daniel looked toward the bench and spoke carefully. "This is the recorded deed for Rosewood Manor." Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Then Daniel pointed toward the designated ownership section near the bottom of the page. "And according to the legally executed transfer instructions signed by Edward Harrington, the beneficiary named on this deed is Maya Brooks." For several seconds after the deed appeared on the courtroom screens, nobody seemed capable of speaking. The silence felt larger than the room itself. Maya sat frozen in her chair, staring at her own name printed on the document. She had spent the entire day listening to people explain why she did not belong. Now the evidence said something entirely different. The evidence said she had belonged all along. Across the aisle, Victoria Harrington slowly lowered herself into her chair. The confidence that had carried her through the hearing was gone. Around her, relatives exchanged stunned looks. Some stared at the deed. Others stared at Maya. None of them seemed certain what to say. Daniel Foster quietly closed the remaining files and allowed the court to absorb the moment. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes before setting them down. "The court recognizes the validity of the deed and the supporting records," he said. His voice echoed through the chamber. "The evidence establishes that Edward Harrington intentionally created this succession arrangement and that all verification requirements have been satisfied." Reporters immediately began writing. Camera shutters clicked softly from the back rows. Yet Maya barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the deed. It was not the mansion that mattered most to her. It was the truth. For the first time in her life, she understood why her name had appeared in files nobody could explain. She understood why Edward Harrington had spent years protecting records others overlooked. Most importantly, she understood that she had never been the outsider everyone believed her to be. Daniel leaned toward her and smiled gently. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." Maya looked up in surprise. "My grandfather?" Daniel nodded. "Edward never stopped making sure your future would be protected. Even when others forgot certain promises, he did not." Maya glanced toward the large photograph standing near the front of the courtroom. The billionaire's calm expression seemed different now. Not distant. Familiar. As though a piece of her own story had finally come into focus. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and poured across the courthouse windows, filling the room with warm afternoon light. The judge concluded the proceedings and spectators slowly began gathering their belongings. Yet before anyone could leave, Daniel removed one final item from his briefcase. It was the original photograph of Rosewood Manor with Edward Harrington, Angela Brooks, and the small child standing between them. He handed it to Maya. "This belongs with you now," he said. Maya accepted it carefully. The photograph felt lighter than before, not because it weighed less, but because it no longer carried unanswered questions. As people filed out of the courtroom, several members of the Harrington family paused near her. None laughed. None whispered. Some simply nodded respectfully before continuing toward the exit. Maya remained seated for a moment longer, holding the photograph in one hand and looking at the deed resting on the table. The day had begun with people asking why she was there. It ended with everyone finally understanding the answer. She stood, smiled softly, and walked toward the courthouse doors carrying something far more valuable than a mansion. She carried the truth.